For years, the land of pleasant living has had a conflict bubbling just beneath the genteel surface.
I grew up in a society of segregation in Talbot County.
And a copper-clad boy with a rebel flag became the focus of two very different sets of beliefs and emotion.
What really got me to this project was the Charlottesville riot, let's call it. I hadn't paid a lot of attention to Civil War monuments. You know, they were there, they've always been part of the battlefield scene, courthouses, things like that, especially throughout the South, and in the North too. I mean, there's monuments in lots and lots of places. But when that happened in Charlottesville, and you've got Nazis and the KKK rallying around Robert E. Lee's monument, my thought was, I've got enough time in the Civil War history business, let's call it, that my thought was, you know, what would Bobby Lee think of this? And my impression was, I don't think he'd think much of it. You know, he wasn't a guy that was interested in monuments anyway. But then to have this thing where you've got these folks who are people that I don't think he would have been going to war for, using his monument as a rallying point, and then the whole thing turned into what it turned into. And so I looked at that and I thought, you know, but maybe there's a project around Civil War monuments, the Confederate battle flag, you know, those kind of things, because they obviously had become flashpoint issues.
Why in the world would you want to take that history away and pretend it didn't happen by removing that statue?
They were placed here and elsewhere to remind African Americans that nothing had really changed after the Civil War.
And, you know, I had other projects I was doing, so it was kind of a back burner thing. And I talked with a fellow I was working with, Gene Bruskin. And Gene had produced a musical, historical musical, kind of in the ilk of Hamilton, but set in the Reconstruction period right after the Civil War, and Frederick Douglass is one of his main characters. And one day in conversation about it, and we were documenting the musical, and Gene and I talked about this, and I said, you know, I was kind of interested in this monument issue and maybe doing something with that. And nothing came of that right away, but there was a point where he called me or sent me an email and said a friend of his, Denise Lombard, was involved in this Move the Monument project here in Easton. And he said, would you like to talk with her? And I said, yeah, sure, why not? We talked, and I thought, yeah, maybe this is where I go with this. And I met with her and a couple of people who were involved with that project a couple of times. I did more research, and I said, yeah, I'd be interested in doing this. Now, this was, first time I talked to Denise was a little after the monument had been moved. And so it's a little over a year ago, because we're right at about the 1 year anniversary. But I was very involved in a couple of other projects, and I said, you know, I'm not going to be able to get to this right away. So after like the end of the summer, I guess, was when I started to have a little more time, and we talked a little more, and I stayed busy till about Christmas, and then it was like, okay, I've got some time coming up, I can really start to focus on this. So I did more research and said to them, you know, is there any event happening where we might be able to get, you know, 8 or 10 people together that I can do some preliminary interviews, that we could put together a pitch video and go out and see if we can raise funds and if there's interest in doing this, and do that. And there was an event coming up at the library where they were hiring this archivist who's doing all this, you know, Caitlin. And we talked to the library, and what I tried to do was see if we could do the interviews there, but they had other things going on, they were too busy. And the Avalon Theater allowed us to use their TV studio. And so we got, I think I had 9 people that were at this thing about the archives at the library to say they would come do interviews. So we scheduled them, they came over, And we did about 15 minutes a piece. So, you know, they weren't way in depth, but it was enough to get a sense of story from each one, you know, who the characters are, you know, that kind of thing. And it was a good variety of people. I mean, it included Richard Potter, Harriet Lowry, Paul Callahan, Mickey Tyrone.
The reasons he wanted the monument removed, you know, one of the reasons was they only fought to preserve slavery. And I mean, that was a valid accusation, but it didn't really fit with Maryland or Talbot County history.
And don't forget, hundreds of African Americans from this county fought for the Union. What happened to them after the war? And look at how the Confederate soldiers were rewarded.
I took that footage and started to work with it. And I was also talking with David Montgomery and was able to set up just a separate interview with him. And once I had his interview and came back with it, there was a piece that he did and a piece that Harriet Lowry did that I thought really worked well together.
But as long as it's not in the public space, we might be all right with that, yes?
Come inside the debate between Move the Monument and Preserve Talbot History.
But it's like, you know, I've done a lot of projects with archival footage and that kind of thing, and now I'm starting to go, oh, what I'm doing now becomes archival footage in 50 years or 100 years or something that people come back and want to understand what happened. You know, as you get into the story, you know, you start to go, oh, you know, well, that's part of my question here. You know, did the right thing happen?
Discover why and how a statue erected in 1916 on the courthouse lawn in eastern Maryland was removed a year ago and placed on a battlefield in Virginia related to its past. Can Talbot County reconcile its differences? What comes next in the 400-year arc of history?